Ok. Ça c'est en anglais. Si je parle trop vite, just stop me. You can ask questions, you can interrupt. L'interruption, c'est bon. Okay. Nietzsche's lectures at the University of Basel on the pre-Platonic philosophers, offered in the summer sessions of 1872, 1873, and 1876, are notable, amongst other things, for their correlation of pre-Platonic physics, or rather the natural philosophy of Greek antiquity, with the physics and chemistry of Nietzsche's day. That is, for their correlation of ancient and modern Sophia and Scientia. But the ancient physiologoi, the ancient natural philosophers, physiologue, Greek physiologoi, are not taken in these lectures as precursors or forerunners to modern physics. They are read instead as fellow researchers, fellow investigators, as colleagues, if you will. And Nietzsche the physician, Nietzsche the latter-day physiologon, gives three of the pre-Platonics or pre-Platonic physiologoi pride of place in his lectures: Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and Socrates. These three, he states, are the purest paradigms of what he called philosophical types. Plato and later philosophers after him being mix and match versions of these archetypes. Nietzsche devotes his longest and most intensive lectures to Pythagoras, the Pythagoreans, and to Heraclitus. Indeed, his own future philosophy emerges from between these two pre-Platonic pillars. Boy, there's going to be a lot of P's in here. Socrates, the third, Socrates, like Pythagoras, but without the latter's religious overtones, oaths, and rituals, stands as an exemplar of philosophical life, of a life lived philosophically to its end. His life was steered not by self-interest, the accusation Heraclitus had lodged against Pythagoras, but by the philosophical kybernetes, as in Heraclitus' 41st fragment. Unlike Socrates, Heraclitus withdrew from society, and in a sense, the two Nietzschean pillars, Heraclitus on the one hand and Pythagoras on the other, were inversions one of the other. Heraclitus refusing and withdrawing from political office, his role as Ephesian Basileus, and Pythagoras taking up precisely this role at Crotona. Pythagoras' interest in politics, leadership, and good government gained him harsh Heraclitean criticism, the latter famously stating in one of his fragments, fragment 129, I refer to the Deals numbering, that although he had pursued inquiry further than all other men, Pythagoras was too picky, too particular. By choosing what he liked from his data, he made a wisdom of his own, instead of hearkening to the one and only phuseos, the one and only logos. The one and only logos, which Heraclitus at times called phuseos, at times polemos, and at times a flickering flame, pyros, was the same for all, this is fragment 2, and yet ever-changing, always at odds with itself. The same for all, and yet never self-same, that which never itself stays the same. No god or man made this logos, that's fragment 30. It is not a private creation or possession, fragment 2, and yet most men live as though they had their own logos, their own logic, their own words, their own world. According to Heraclitus, this was also the case with Pythagoras. Pythagoras, he admitted, was polymathein, many learned, a very learned man, but nevertheless kakotechnian, a man of bad technique. All of Pythagoras' artful methods via his sephoi, or in Latin calx, from which we get the idea of calculation, all his calculations, his counting stones, via his sephoi, via his geometrical proofs, via his own via philosophia, his aesthetic praxis, all of these were for Heraclitus meta-hodoi, meta-hodologies, gestures away from, aside from, beside, beyond, meta, the true path, the veritable course, the hodos philosophos. The physiologon, the one who would pursue the physiologos, and the philosophos, philosopher as such, must avoid, this is Heraclitus, must avoid the imposition of technique, of technical know-how, of know-how in general, impositions which are, with respect to the logos at hand, impostors, foreign and alien to the veritable matrix or mathesis, which is ever-flowing, ever-changing, and ever in need of reconsideration and recalculation, a perpetual education in the sense of edicere, being conducted elsewhere, the Latin translation of the Greek word mathesis. Heraclitus called Pythagoras the prince of impostors, this is fragment 81, because of his impositions, his kakotechnion, his bad techniques, which masked the here and now with prior and post determinations, not to mention personal predilections. The logos, again, is not a private creation or possession, and although it is the fount, Pagan, and root, rhizoma, of persons and possessions, it is also utterly, or rather unutterably, impersonal, impossible to capture and confine at a personal, individual level, always flowing forth from them, flowing forth from such ordinations into the greater coordinate context qua matrix. The logos is not only the matrix or mathesis of Pythagoras, the latter's tetrad or tetractys of 1, 2, 3, and 4, which add up to 10 and make up the tenfold triangle, which is the entire decimal system for him. It is not only that, but also the system, matrix, or mathesis's circuits, feedback loops, and inner interrelations, which Pythagoras, via his disciple Hippasus, discovered to be downright incalculable. An alogos in Greece, or surd in Latin, which is soul en français, unspoken, unspeakable, unheeded, and unheard en anglais. The logos is thus a logos alogos. It speaks the unspeakable, the unheeded, and the unheard, the ultimately incalculable and absurd. This is Heraclitus' logos. Aristotle, in the Metaphysics, reminds us that Hippasus, the Pythagorean, was said to have taught Heraclitus, and to have divulged in so doing this terrible secret, that of the incalculable with and in all things calculable. The Byzantine Suda also attests to this interconnection, namely the ancient tradition which states that Heraclitus had been a pupil of the Pythagorean philosopher Hippasus of Metapontum, who, like Heraclitus, believed the universe to be in a state of incessant change and that it consists of fire as its prime element, in this case paraphrasing a gloss by Wheelwright. In any case, Hippasus and Heraclitus were what we might call post-Pythagorean pre-Platonics, and the polemical interconnection of Pythagoras and Heraclitus via Hippasus was of incalculable importance for the formation of Nietzsche's own philosophical thought, as Nandita actually pointed out before. In light of these connections, Nietzsche's presentation of Pythagoras and Heraclitus as the two pillars, and along with Socrates, the three purest paradigms of ancient and modern philosophy, the pursuit of Sophia and Scientia, might perhaps now appear less bizarre. The reason he called his lectures on pre-Platonic rather than pre-Socratic philosophers was in order to underscore the paradigm shift and the break with physiological exploration, the break with the phuseologos as such, which Plato and philosophy after Plato presents. The logos from Plato onward was not a logos alogos, but a logos supposedly expressed, at least in part, in and through its many different manifestations. Each manifestation, each phenomenon, was a pale imitation and thus a reflection of the Platonic logos. Charting the line of the imitatio logos would lead us, through such dialogoi, to the whole truth that these partial truths each endeavor in their own way to express. According to Plato, then, the logos is or can be expressed. According to Heraclitus and Hippasus, however, the logos, always a logos, far from being expressed, is, in the spirit of tragic philosophy, always instead suppressed, trampled upon underfoot, crushed like the earthworm of Bataille's informe. What it designates, here quoting Bataille en anglais, total perversion, has no rights in any sense and gets itself squashed everywhere, like a spider or an earthworm. For academic men to be happy, it seems that the universe would have to take shape. On the other hand, affirming that the universe resembles nothing and is only formless amounts to saying that the universe is something like a spider or spit. Très Georges Bataille. Or here, in this lecture, that the universe is like a pre-Platonic logos a logos. Following Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze referred to the pre-Platonic logos a logos, or which we can also understand as the phuseologos, as a veritable anti-logos when compared to the logos of Aristocles Plato and of philosophy's logocentric tradition afterward. This in an interview with Arnaud Villani. Has the anti-logos returned despite Plato? Villani therefore asked Deleuze. According to Deleuze, it has not. The logos a logos, or physiological anti-logos, still remains buried in philosophy's graveyard, backyard, or background, as a rhizome that runs underground. Relating it to the physiology, the involuntary or will-less physics of Proust's Mémoires involontaires, rather than to quote the tricks of the sophists, unquote, he, Deleuze, suggests that the physiologos, logos or anti-logos, remains, as Heraclitus himself had said, encrypted, covered over in the compost heap of perceptual and conceptual history. Phuseos crypteste philei. I can't speak Greek, so that's the best you get. That wrote Heraclitus. Nature loves to hide, fragment 123. Its discovery, as the Paracelsian alchemical philosopher Gerhard Dorn once said, and Walter Benjamin long after him, is a matter of digging into the refuse of history, of getting into the gutter, of trudging through the trash, of facing what has been effaced, abandoned, and objected. Phuseos crypteste philei suggests that the physiologos, logos, or anti-logos has always been abandonment, meant for the refuse bin, garbage can, and compost heap, as much in philosophical antiquity as it is and always was in philosophical modernity. Seekers of gold dig up much earth and find little, wrote Heraclitus in fragment 22. Seek not the gold as goal then, but rather, as Nietzsche said, the sense of the earth. And this is Nietzsche. Under such flattering colors, makeup, and jewelry of human vanity, the basic text of Homo Natura must again be recognized. He wrote this in the preface to his Zarathustra. To translate man back into nature, into phusis, into the physiologos, is the task of the modern philosopher, the philosopher who endeavors to articulate der Sinn der Erde, the sense of the earth, the ground of being. This earth or ground, like the ever-flowing nature of the Pythagoreans or the ever-burning fire of Heraclitus and Hippasus, this earth or ground as the ever-flowing nature of the Pythagoreans and the ever-burning fire of Heraclitus and Hippasus, is ever-changing, ever-rearranging, ever-transmuting or transmogrifying. It is in a state of incessant becoming, and becoming is its mode of being. Stable structures are, with respect to this ground, metastable facades, metastable facets of an otherwise ongoing ontogenesis. Stable structures are prostheses with respect to this thesis, this perpetual placing and replacing. And this includes ourselves, our very sense of self, which is not of the earth, but off it. The self is a prosthesis, an appendage, a technologon, technologically articulating facets, facades of a more fundamental and fundamentally constitutive compost, an earthly aggregate or pre-prosthetic field. This is why Heraclitus begins his inquiry not as René Descartes does with the self, or in Heraclitus' case, the ancient Greek hupokimenon, but rather with a search for the self. I searched for myself, he wrote in fragment 101. In other words, his path, the hodos philosophos, began prior to his individuality, in the midst and midden, the garbage and or compost heap, of his individuation, his process of self-creation and of auto and ontogenesis. An individual self, according to the Pythagoreans, is also understood as a metastable aspect, facade, or facet. The individual manifestation of an ongoing metempsychosis, a series of possible, actually partial solutions to a cryptic, encrypted question, what Alfred Jarry would have called a profound pataphysical question or problem. Selves concress only to dissolve and then resolve again. Their stability is always illusory, imaginary, an imaginary solution or solution via image resolution to a prior pre-individual problematical and paradoxical fount, Pagan, and root, rhizoma, a tangled web of interconnections analogous or harmonious to the logos of Heraclitus and to the tetractys or triangular flame of the Pythagoreans, the pyramid or pyre of every numero-connotational permutation. This puts Pythagorean and Heraclitean natural philosophy in the neighborhood not only of Nietzschean genealogy, but also the environmental mechanology of Simondonian theorists today. Mechanology could here be understood as the logos or logi of the ancient Greek mekhos, or Proto-Indo-European maghana, pre-Platonic words for power in the sense of capacity, capability, ability, and the force that enables. from the base root mag, out of which come English words like mighty and German words like the Macht of Nietzsche's Wille zur Macht, the Nietzschean élan vital. Mechanology, in a sense, understands logos, in the sense of phuseologos, as Wille zur Macht, the propulsive force or élan vital of existent things. It is the force that gives rise, phuseo, to things, the force of individuation. And in mechanological analyses, although things, individual subjects and objects, play a part, they do not play a central part, nor even a teleological one. The thing itself is not the goal, precisely because, mechanologically, following the mechos of the phuseologos, a thing is never by itself, and what's more, is never itself. A thing, an individual subject or object, individualizes itself transductively. It is, in other words, a transduction. To translate man back into nature, phuseological translation, translates man, human being generally and in particular, as transduction. Transduction is in some sense a composting, posting at once two different features or multiple aspects in a manifold manner. In the first English study wholeheartedly devoted to Simondonian theory, a study entitled Trancheductions, the Scotsman Adrian Mackenzie, now at Lancaster in the UK, explained the process of transduction as follows. For the process of transduction to occur, there must be some disparity, discontinuity, or mismatch within a domain. Transduction is the process whereby a disparity or difference is topologically and temporally restructured, one might say modulated. It is the mediation of different organizations of energy. Régis Debray uses the term mediology instead of mechanology to describe transductive philosophy, understanding transduction as a mediation pure and simple, however complex it may be. Heraclitus has had his own word for the medium message, or McLuhan-esque medium is the message mediation of transduction, the Greek word synapsis. Miroslav Markovic translates Heraclitean synapsis as connection, and translates the synapsis fragment 10, as follows. Quote, connections, things whole and things not whole, something which is being brought together and something which is being brought apart, something which is in tune and something which is out of tune. Out of everything that can be made a unity, and out of this unity all things are made, unquote. Such connection or transduction is synonymous, according to Heraclitus, with the phuseologos itself. And the connection of connection or transduction and the logos, connection as the logos, led Martin Heidegger to define the Heraclitean logos as a gathering together of that which lies disparate. A gathering together that nevertheless lets that which lies disparate lie before us in its disparity. Something I would say, trancheduction. Moving from Martin Heidegger's study of early Greek thinking to Muriel Combe's study of the individual and the collective according to Simondon, quote, we will call transduction this mode of unity of being through its diverse phases, its multiple individuations, unquote. We are coherent individuals for all of our incoherence by way of transduction, transductively. Transduction conserves and integrates the opposed and, for Nietzsche, antagonistic aspects of every existent thing. Everything in its existence. In his study of transduction, Mackenzie makes an astute interconnection between transductive interrelation, transductive mediation, and the phuseological insights of Michel Serres, who, in an interview with Bruno Latour, articulated his philosophy of communication, his philosophy of Hermès thought, in terms of, quote-unquote, enfolded time. To think transduction and to think transductively, quote, our first step is to look for the folding of time, unquote. Mackenzie then continues, quote, folding replaces separation in such a perspective. Transductive mediation brings together elements that are not strictly contemporary or simultaneous in terms of their geneses. As an assemblage or multiplicity, a transductive mediation assembles heterogeneous elements from different times, from the Paleolithic to the contemporary. Consider a late model car, for example, an example provided by Michel Serres. It is a disparate aggregate of scientific and technical solutions dating from different periods. One can date it component by component, This part was invented at the turn of the century, another 10 years ago, and Carnot's cycle is almost 200 years old, unquote. From one perspective, Mackenzie admits, this appears to be a trivial point, a trivial machine. Quote, of course the elements of an ensemble have differently dated origins. The thermonuclear bomb, for instance, still involves technical elements such as bolts and screws. The invention of a bolt lies hundreds of years back in date from the vector processor of the supercomputer, which handles the floating point calculations needed to model what will happen to the bolt after detonation. In that sense, there are clearly no present-day artifacts, only mixtures which associate elements inherited from different times, unquote. However, the argument is more complicated than this, Mackenzie explains. Rather than unilinear progress from past to future, time flows in a turbulent and chaotic manner, as Serre pointed out to Latour. Because this mixing of technical elements introduces detours or transverse connections, Heraclitean connections, in both the many, i.e. a given collectivity, and every manifold individuality, i.e. given individual objects or subjects. The many and or manifold enfold networks of relation which mediology, mechanology, connective or we could say compost modern consideration brings to light. The transduction of these networks function like the pilot principle of which Heraclitus and later and after him Socrates in the Republican statesman spoke. Kybernetic transductions permit these networks of relations to vary their topology without always falling apart. As Mackenzie again explains, quote, when an alternate path between 2 points opens, the actors or nodes, the manifold or many, within the network are exposed to alternate rhythms of contact. As 2 points in a network, previously separated by a certain distance or delay, become more closely linked, time within the collective folds in some way. Depending on the scale of the detour, the mesh of relations composing the collective manifold becomes augmented and distorted. When a different mediation enters the mesh of relations, different cycles and repetitions start up. Thus time, the very form of the irreversible redundancy according to Serre, is folded differently. These rhythms, produced by synchronizations and delays, involve repetitions, cycles, and feedback loops working against, with, through, or independent of other repetitions, cycles, and beats. Unquote. A mere few days ago, I was working in our garden back in Canada, pulling weeds and digging out an especially aggressive and expansive one, Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is a rapidly spreading rhizome, each tubular part or segment of which has raised joints or nodes out of which arborescent bamboo tree-like extrusions can develop whenever the conditions are right, and pretty well always right. Its tubers, and therefore its bamboo tree-like extrusions, can grow in almost any kind of soil, from the most arid and inhospitable to the richest composted topsoil. They can also cut through wood, brick, cement, and of course other plants in a rather monological, non-dialectical manner. That said, it does tend toward paths of least resistance, at least at first, working around obstacles via detours and often turning along them, following the folds of the obstacle itself and becoming in some sense the obstacle's analog. This was the seed, or rather the tuber, that gave rise to the in the compost of a few days' composition to the present paper, this presentation, and its reflections on non-dialectical transduction. It brings me back to the logos prior to Plato, and to the terrain and terrible logic of Hippasus and Heraclitus. Reading the weeds, weeding and writing, and in some sense becoming weed myself, following their hodos, their network pathways, it dawned upon me, like the sun always knew, that my struggle with them, the polemos, was in no way an alternate logos. We were joined with and in a singular network. Every slice into it, every tranche, chaque tranche, each section I dug up, uprooted, removed, being this network's further realization and reticulation. There was no outside of this text, no all text or all odos, only an infinitely enfolding and unfolding network, a monstrous Hypasio-Heraclitean mathesis, akin to the third dialogos that was the great secret and great terror of the Pythagoreans, the uncalculable matrix of the universal mathesis. The end.